Okay, good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. Thanks for joining. Plan for today's session, as sort of advertised, was the idea we're looking at three-dimensional approaches to using LiDAR data. And this has fallen under the rather broader heading of another look at LiDAR visualization. I'm aware that lots of you came to my original LiDAR talks way back when, long in the distant past, before COVID was a word we even knew. Um, when we were able to get together in virtuals and other places to actually meet in person. And you may remember in that original LiDAR workshop, I talked a bit about different visualization methods. Some of you may have looked at the visualization tutorial on the portal as well. So this session really is to look in a bit more detail at how visualization works and the different pros and cons of different approaches. And in particular, we'll finish with sort of probably the second half of the session, having a look at methods and the advantages and the disadvantages of using three-dimensional sort of environments to look at LiDAR data and whether it is a better way forward, whether it's the future or not, I guess. Bear with me, this is the first time obviously running this particular session, so we'll see how it goes. I think it's probably about an hour long with some audience participation in there, but we'll see. The PowerPoint is a little bit sort of last minute thrown together, so not loads and loads of images, but hopefully lots of time if my computer will play ball for us to have a bit of a play with three-dimensional stuff in real time. I hope the internet holds up, because an inevitable consequence of working with three-dimensional data and trying to stream onto Teams, and to add further complication into the mix, I'm also going to be remotely dialing into my desktop at work because it's a more powerful computer, but that does add in the extra sort of bottleneck of another internet connection. So hopefully things will all go to plan. So just to start with going back to some basics really, and the question of, well, what is visualization actually for? Why do we need to be concerned about this term, this idea? And the basic principle behind this is that our LiDAR data, when we get it, obviously it starts off as a point cloud, and from that we turn it into our digital terrain model. So our bare earth model of what is the height above sea level of every square, in our case 25 centimeters, across the Chilterns landscape. And if you were just to display a digital terrain model in a bit of GIS software, it is a raster dataset, so you'll choose the way that you want to show your raster dataset, and in many cases you'll essentially show it as different colors representing different heights. So in this case, darker colors meaning lower above sea level, and lighter colors meaning higher above sea level. And of course, in a color ramp like this, you can't see very much in the way of detail, and certainly not detail in the scales where we are interested as archaeologists. We can see the sort of the topography, the geology, the result of chalk streams, dry valleys in the landscape in this image. We can see some larger man-made features, so such as obviously there's a road coming down here, there's obviously a kind of platformy thing here, so building, maybe another one up here. But actually, in terms of archaeology, obviously we can see nothing, and you will recognise that that's a problem with showing the imagery like this. So as I say there, in particular, it's those minor variations of altitude in the broad scale we expect for most archaeological features. So is that sort of plus or minus 5 meters? Our largest hill fort ramparts, for example, are probably 5 or 6 meters variation from bottom of ditch to top of bank. And also a lateral scale, lateral dimensions of 100 meters, 200 meters at most for most of our archaeological features. So hill fort again might be a couple of hundred meters across. A field system might be a few hundred meters across, but really most of the discrete archaeological features we're looking at, so the actual banks of that hill fort or the banks of the field system, our saw pits, our quarry pits, all those kinds of things tend to be less than 100 meters in lateral dimension as well. So we need to choose visualization methods that allow us to bring out those smaller features in the landscape. And what we're using it for, we want it to aid us in the prospection and interpretation of archaeological features. So we need to be able to spot them clearly, and we need to be able to sort of have a good view of their shape, their morphology, their the sort of details of how they survive on the ground. We want to be able to make more features more visible, of course. We want the technique to work, in inverted commas, even over differing landscape types. So we may have some difficulty where we've got steep slopes versus flat lowlands versus flat uplands, for example. We may have difficulties working between wooded landscapes versus ploughed flat farmed landscapes. Different techniques, different parameters, different approaches may well yield better or worse results in and between those different sort of landscape types. So that's an issue that we may have to deal with, and the visualization type that we eventually sort of opt for, we want to be relatively good across all of these landscape types, if we can. Another element that may be important to us is being quick and easy to create. It's quite a long time ago now as I made the visualizations for the LiDAR portals, but I think probably each one was 3 or 4 days work of processing of my work computer being completely locked up with creating these things, which I think in the grand scheme of a 3-year project obviously is not a particularly big investment of time. But if you were working with LiDAR data in perhaps a slightly different way, where you do have the need to really quickly and easily create these visualizations, then this may well become a factor. Another element that I think we need to consider is the ease with which we can transfer these visualization file types, the ease with which we can load them into different environments that we might want to use them, and the ease with which we can manipulate them, that we can look around them, that we can further edit them or alter them, overlay them with other data sets. These are all considerations, I think. They maybe come secondary to that question of can we actually see archaeology in them, but I think they are still important considerations when it comes to the data management and actual functioning of a project involving LiDAR data. And finally, they need to be efficient to analyze. And so again, this probably ties into those questions of manipulation and visibility, but we need to be able to perhaps systematically work through these different bits of visualization of different bits of the landscape, and we need to be able to record features in ways that are straightforward over the top of that LiDAR visualization. So I think these are all considerations that need to come into play when it comes to opting for different ways of displaying LiDAR data. Sad to say, despite you may remember my protestations during that original LiDAR workshop where I talked about visualization techniques, sad to say that still today I see probably most people using LiDAR I see still using single direction hillshades, despite the fact that it's been recognized now for the best part of a decade, if not longer, that they potentially aren't the best way to be working with LiDAR data, that they have significant weaknesses, and that we have significantly better approaches now available to us relatively easily. But sadly, single direction hillshades still what you tend to see. So whenever I see commercial archaeology working with LiDAR data, even sort of other public sector archaeology organizations working with LiDAR data, inevitably it still seems to be a single direction hillshade. Just to remind you a little bit about what those are, you may recognize these slides from a long time ago. So how does a single hillshade work? We essentially shine sunlight, as it were, across our digital terrain model from a chosen altitude and a chosen azimuth. So the altitude is what degree above the horizon or down from the zenith our sun angle is, and the azimuth is what angle around from north is our sun angle. And it shines across our landscape, and it calculates where would there be highlights and where would there be shadows in our landscape, in our digital terrain model. So in this particular example, being highlighted, being shone from the northwest, you can see that this slope facing that sun angle is really nicely highlighted, whereas the slopes kind of downstream of that sun angle, facing down to the southeast, are more shaded. And of course, it means that our earthworks are sort of lit up again from that northwest. So the rampart here of Boddington Camp is lit up from the northwest, whereas the rampart here is essentially casting a shadow into the ditch, making that ditch look deeper on the southeast side, making the ditch look shallower on the northwest side, and the rampart look bigger perhaps on this side and smaller on this side. So that's how single directional hillshade works. They are very easy to compute. Everyone knows about them. Most desktop GIS software, you can compute these sort of in the software itself. You don't have to go and find specialist software to make this. And they are very easy to interpret. I think it's very straightforward to look at this and get an idea. Once you've got your head around, there's a sun angle, it's coming from this direction. You can start to identify the shapes of the landscape within it. The significant downsides, though, are you may get some areas sort of overlit versus others underlit. So this hillside here, for example, is really sort of almost whited out. There's so much sunlight hitting it that we can't really see much in terms of the variation on there. You may be able to make out there's a few features on this slope, but they're very difficult to see clearly. And the second major problem with this technique is that if there are any features parallel to our angle of our azimuth angle, the angle that the sun's coming in, they will be completely invisible because they won't be casting a shadow or a highlight in any direction. And as a result, you need to compare different sun angles. Another maybe a small issue there is that features do move from their real position, which makes feature mapping, so trying to digitize features, potentially slightly difficult, because of course you're looking at sort of the shadows or the highlights of a feature rather than the actual feature itself. And then finally, another potential issue for further querying of the data, further working with the data set, is that the units in this raster are not real units. So they just essentially run from -1 to +1, give or take, of how much sunlight is hitting them. But if I wanted to, for example, draw a profile across this rampart to say, well, how high, what's the variation in height across this rampart between the top of the bank and the bottom of the ditch? If I drew a profile, used a profile tool in GIS to try and do that, it would give me a value between -1 and +1 of how lit up by the sun they are, and it would be completely meaningless. It wouldn't give us the shape of that feature as we want it. And just to demonstrate the difference that different sun angles can make, you can see very clearly that when we change the sun angle from to being one from over here, suddenly we get really clear little sunken ways or hollows coming up the hillside there that we just couldn't see really before. These are sizable archaeological features. And the other thing to point out are these little lines across the middle of the hill fort here, which are field boundaries, probably post-medieval field boundaries. Very subtle low banks, which again, because they were parallel to the light source in that first image, were completely invisible, not a single sign of them. So real problems with this technique. It always makes me sad when I see people still using it. For today's session, as our case study, we're going to be using this area around Pulpit Hill Fort in Buckinghamshire. So Pulpit Hill Fort's just off here to the north. This is Whiteleaf Hill, kind of just here to the west. And this is a patch of the LiDAR that some of you will have seen before because I've used it in my review and improving interpretation tutorial. But today we're going to take another look at it using different visualization methods to see, whether we like what we're looking at, what kind of things we can see in one visualization and not in another. So just some of the key features to draw your attention to. I think it's really important that we're able to recognize the landscape shape in any visualization type we use, and not all are as good at it as others. Single directional hillshade actually is pretty good at it. I think hopefully once you've kind of got your eye and worked out whether things are sticking out or sticking in, that sort of optical illusion that you sometimes get trying to work out whether things are positive or negative features in a hillshade image. Once you've got your eye in there, I think hopefully you'll be able to recognize we've got dry valleys running down sort of to the northwest as a general orientation. So the uplands are here heading downwards into the Vale of Aylesbury to the northwest. In terms of man-made features that we might have coming out of here, the various things that we're going to be spotting in our different LiDAR images, we've obviously got various trackways coming up and running along the top of the escarpment here. We've got a rabbit warren, a pillow mound just in here. We've got field systems in here and in here, quite subtle features. We've got lots of pits, saw pits and other chalk pits, extraction pits, clay pits possibly, across here. And then we've got some linear features that are quite interesting. So we've got the wood bank running along here. We've got a rather larger bank and ditch running across here. There's a little trackway running through here, but you can't see it very well at all in the single directional hillshade because this one happens to be broadly parallel to our light source. And there's another interesting wiggly feature just down here that's quite interesting. It crosses that big wide trackway there and sort of meanders up here. Again, it's not particularly clear or easy to interpret in the single directional hillshade. And I would say our field systems are not particularly clear. This one down here is all right because lots of those banks are perpendicular to our sun angle, so they come out quite nice and clearly. But this field system, lots of the larger banks are actually parallel to that light source, as we'll see in a second. So they don't come out very clearly. We only really see those perpendicular ones coming across. So that's our first image, our single directional hillshade, one that does some things well, but other things not as well. As I said, we do have lots of newer methods that have been developed largely since about probably about 2008, 2010 onwards. People started to adopt different methods for looking at LiDAR data to try and extract as much information as possible to make it as easy to work with as possible. So the ones we're going to look at today: multi-directional hillshade, sky view factor, and local relief model. Ones that you're probably largely familiar with, particularly the multi-directional hillshade and the local relief model. If you've used the portal, you've used these. Sky view factor I haven't put on the portal, in part because I'm lazy and in part because there's reasons why I don't like it, but we'll talk about those in a second. So just to remind you again of how they work: multi-directional hillshade, rather than our single sun angle being displayed between black and white of where the highlights are and the shadows are, with a multi-directional hillshade we use the three color bands of red, green, and blue to show three different single directional hillshades at once in the same image. So in this horrid image, we have red coming down from north, green coming in from the southeast, and blue coming in from the southwest as our three sun angles, making a not particularly nice image to look at. But the idea is that it removes lots of the problems of the single directional hillshade, such as that need to compare multiple images, features being hidden by being completely whited out or shaded, and features being parallel to one particular light source. So in this particular image, some of those problems are fixed, although this is not a nice one to look at. Just to look at our version of our landscape here near Pulpit Hill, hopefully we're seeing some improvement on that previous image. We still, I think, get a really nice good look at the landscape shape. Our pillow mound has come out well. Our trackways come out, I think, pretty clearly. Our linear ditch and bank comes out nicely. Our wood bank comes out nicely. We can see a bit more of that possible trackway sort of curving off around there. Before in the single direction hillshade we can only really see that southern section. Now we can see a bit more of that coming off to the north. And our funny little meandering feature, it's not the easiest to see, is it? It's quite confused by this kind of dominance of the orangey colours in this area. So it doesn't stand out particularly well, but we can see maybe a bit more of it than we could before. We will have a direct look at the comparison between these different visualization techniques in a second, so you can see them side by side. Our field system, again, it's not doing brilliantly. You can make it out, but it doesn't stand out, does it? And potentially it actually stands out less well than it did before in the single directional hillshade, at least this one down here. Up here we potentially have a bit of a better view. Can you see we've got some of those shorter small banks that were completely invisible before appearing down there? So some improvement, I think, in some cases, but maybe some negatives as well. Next one to look at: local relief model, or also known as trend removal. So the principle behind this technique, rather than a sort of sunlight being shone across a landscape and casting shadows, we're actually sort of doing mathematics on the landscape itself to calculate whether an individual pixel, an individual part of the landscape stands out or is different relative to the general trend of the landscape in that area. So hence the name trend removal. So essentially we take a pixel, we look at a certain radius around it and say, well, what's the general trend of the landscape in that radius? So for example, it may be generally sloping down to the right, as in this case. This is obviously a cross section through the landscape, but imagine we took this pixel in the middle here, this pixel here in the middle. The general trend across the neighboring 20 meters, say, is a general slope down in one direction. If we then remove that trend from that radius, where does that pixel now stand? And you can see we've kind of flattened out the slope, and that makes the minor variations, minor deviations in landscape surface far clearer. They now become the dominant variation in the landscape of plus or minus 5 meters, say, on this scale, as opposed to in this image where the general trend of the landscape is plus or minus 20 meters, which means that any of these small variations where we hope we might find archaeology are going to be completely swamped, are going to be kind of hidden in the larger variation that we have to illustrate with our color ramp. So this technique, particularly good. It's a single image. We don't need to go comparing different images. Again, I think it's a relatively intuitive image to interpret. White means high, black means low. And it is excellent at showing features on sloping terrain. And actually, I think it's excellent at showing features on flat terrain as well. So these two very subtle banks through the middle of Boddington Camp here, they show up pretty nicely. Downsides, though, as I'm sure you're all aware, we do get these kind of false features being manufactured where the trend changes. So here you can see where the steep slope changes to the relatively flat hilltop. We get a little false white feature being created along the top there, which is not a real bank. It's just where that trend has changed. It's that hinge where the trend changes from steep slope to flat. And you get a lot of that around really steep sudden bits like deep pits or sharp embankments, that kind of thing. You get these false features, which can be a problem. It's kind of a slightly smooth and blurry technique because it's kind of working on this radius, this radius of trend. So it doesn't maybe have the crispness of a hillshade image, which maybe shows up a bit more fine detail of individual features. And then another possible issue is that where you've got features on a slope, if it's a flat feature on a slope, it may appear as a negative feature, or if it's a platform on a slope, it may appear as a positive feature, simply because everything's kind of been rotated slightly away from flat. So some downsides there. But here's our image of our landscape near Pulpit, and I think suddenly this is a far better image for spotting archaeology, in my opinion. Our field systems in particular, I think we've got so much more information about it coming out here in this image than we had in either the hillshade or the multi-directional hillshade. All the banks, no matter what orientation, are coming out quite clearly. Trackway is obviously really clear. Our linear features are really clear. So our ditch and bank here, our wood bank there. And for the first time, I think we're getting a good view of that really subtle, tricky to identify wiggly ditch and bank that's running around there. And our rabbit warren, our pillar mound, obviously comes out really clearly. So that's local relief model. We'll talk again a bit more about pros and cons in a second, comparing them. And then finally, sky view factor. So this is an approach that again works on a radius-based technique. It essentially takes every pixel in the landscape and says, if I were to try and draw a line to the horizon, let's say in 16 different directions around this pixel, what angle will that line have above horizontal, and therefore how much of the sky is visible from this pixel. And you can see that where if you were to do from a pixel on top of a really high point, then that angle that you'd be able to see sky from would be a really wide angle, so almost 180 degrees, possibly more than 180 degrees in every direction. Whereas if you're doing from a pixel at the bottom of a ditch or a pit, then you're going to have a relatively restricted view of the sky because the sides of the pit get in the way. And then we color the pixels in relative to whether they have a high amount of sky view or a low amount of sky view. And we get an image that looks like this. Again, it's a single image. Again, I think it's relatively easy to interpret. Negative features appear particularly clear for some reason, but there's some downsides. Subtle features may appear quite washed out or shadowed if they're in. So subtle features on top of the hill will appear washed out and quite hard to see. So those banks across the top are quite hard to see because those are positive features in an already positive part of the landscape. And our sunken hollows coming down the sides of the hill here are also slightly sort of shadowed because they are negative features in an already relatively negative part of the landscape, because that steep slope automatically cuts out half of the sky view. So some problems there potentially. And for some reason, positive features are less clear than negative features as a general rule. So banks might appear less clear than ditches. So for example, the rampart here, you can't really make out much of the rampart bank, but you can see the ditch very clearly. So our sky view factor of our bit of landscape here in Pulpit Hill, around Pulpit Hill. It's an interesting one, this. Doesn't come out as well as I'd hoped, and I actually compared several different settings of sky view factor to to see whether changing the parameters improved it or not. And this was the best one, as far as in my opinion, of the parameters that I tested. And yeah, on the whole, I'm not very impressed actually, even though sky view factor tends to be a technique that most people recommend, which I think is quite interesting. So our pillow mound, it's not particularly clear, is it? I mean, it is there, but it's not coming out very clearly. The full shape of it isn't particularly apparent. Our trackways, they are there again. And maybe it's a good thing that they're not quite as dominant in the image as they were in the local relief model, because maybe they're less important to us. But again, then maybe not the easiest to sort of unpick and interpret. We've got the weird thing of these are quite large pits here, but because of the way I've tweaked the settings, I went down to a relatively small radius around features to try and pick certain things out more clearly. So these field banks, I couldn't really see in the large radius images because they are small positive features in an already very positive landscape. So I restricted the sky view factor radius to a very small radius, 5 meters, in an attempt to try and get these to show up better. But in doing so, very weirdly, I've made the bottom of quite sort of deep pits have positive sky view because they're far enough away from the edges of the pits that they appear as actually positive bits. And so these almost look like little mounds in the bottom of the pits, which is a slightly weird feature of this. Another thing to draw attention to is that the wood bank here versus the linear ditching bank, I find these very hard to sort of tell apart in terms of character in this sky view image, when we know from the multi-hillshade and the local relief models that these are actually very different in their character. This one's a ditch and a bank. This one is quite wide, whereas this one's a much smaller ditch and bank, both narrower and lower. But actually, they're quite challenging to tell apart in this particular image. I think because the ditch here is wider, which means it's less clear. It still has quite good sky view on the small radius, whereas the ditch here is relatively narrow and so appears quite dark black. Does have a negative sky view. And obviously, as we said, the banks don't show up very clearly because this is a positive landscape. And so a low bank just doesn't really come out clearly at all. So yeah, I wasn't very impressed with this one. And our wiggly ditch and bank around here, again, tricky to spot. So I wasn't very impressed with the sky view. There are things that do come out well are the saw pits, I guess, because they are very small, intense bits of negative sky view. So just to compare them all side by side again, those different images. I forgot to say actually the local relief model, one of the big negatives here, we don't necessarily get a good view of the landscape shape, do we? It's just that basic question of, well, what does the landscape do? Where are the sunken ways going? Where's the dry valleys going? It's quite hard to tell from that image on its own where the sort of higher parts of the landscape and lower parts of the landscape are. With a bit of practice, you get your eye into it more, but it is certainly still challenging. With the sky view factor, I think you do get a reasonably good sort of 3D impression of the landscape. It does look quite nice, I think, like that, but potentially at the cost of other features not appearing clearly. We can do things. We can create little Frankensteins of these different techniques as well. So we don't just have to stick with one technique. As I'm sure you've all discovered in the LiDAR portal, you can change the transparency of the local relief model and the multi-directional hillshade to give you kind of overlain images. And this is a blending of the local relief model and the multi-hillshade. And I think that addresses one of those problems with the local relief model of not getting a good sense of landscape shape. So here, hopefully, that blending means you can maybe see a bit better the broader trends for the landscape, the general shape of the landscape, those dry valleys heading down to the northwest. We could even blend in the sky view factor as well. So this is a blending of all three together. Potentially, this might be getting to one of the best images of the lot, depending on your view. This, I think, adding in the sky view factor with the local relief model does allow us, I think, to address some of the problems that we saw with them. So, for example, having the local relief model influence here means we can see quite a nice difference between our straight linear ditch and bank versus our wood bank. They do appear, again, quite different in character. We get the subtle features, such as the field system showing up a bit more clearly. perhaps than it did in the sky view factor on its own. Our trackway down here showing up a bit more clearly than it did in the sky view factor on its own, and our funny wiggly ditch and here, again showing up more clearly on its own. I think this is a really good test case, this one, because it crosses really undulating terrain, and so it really does challenge the visualizations to do a good job of picking out the detail of this funny wiggly thing. And of course it's also crossed by later features, so this trackway coming across here that crosses over the top and the big trackway crossing over the top really confuse the image. So that I think is a really good test case of our different visualization techniques to see how well they're doing on a sort of variable terrain. So those are the two-dimensional visualization approaches that exist, really, the most important ones that people use today. There are a few others that people use. There's a thing called slope derivative that people sometimes use, which essentially tells you how steep is the slope across your image, which can be quite powerful. There's another one called openness positive and openness negative, which people like to use, which essentially calculates, quite similar to sky view factor, how much positive openness there is, so how, again, similar to sky view factor, how much the sky can you see essentially, and how much negative openness there is, so how restricted is the view, as contrasting images that you can then put together. I haven't included those here because I, again, think they're not the best. But I think let's talk frankly, are there still issues here? One thing to say is that the precise parameters used will make a significant difference to what's visible or not. So remember I said about the sky view factor that using different radiuses between 20, 10, 5 meters, I can show you those different images in a second if you want, does make a really significant difference to the way things show up. And so it does take quite a lot of time and effort to refine down to what settings you need for your landscape. And in particular, when you have an issue such as 1,400 square kilometers of landscape, of course, it's impossible to really find parameter settings that work fantastically across the whole lot, because we have so much variation in our landscape, from the Vale of Aylesbury up the steep escarpment, down the dip slope, in the dry valleys, in our woodlands, in our open arable fields, in our pastoral grassland fields, in our urban environments. So there certainly is an issue there, and I know that some of you we've been talking about the fact that some features are not showing up as clearly as you want them to. In the imagery, I know some people had a bit of a play with print screening out of the portal and trying to see whether they could tweak any more data out, any more information out of the images by sort of photoshopping them essentially, and that certainly worked for some of you. Worth saying as well that tricky element to this is that I can produce the images for use in GIS, and I can really carefully control, for example, the color ramp and the settings of the color ramp to see how dark and light it might make the local relief model, for example. But we have far less control over the way these things display when we put them into web-based GIS using essentially OpenGIS, Open Web GIS standards. I have far less control over that. And so those of you who are in the review portal will know that I've put in two versions of the local relief model now. One that's called the sort of light local relief model, one that's the darker local relief model, to see if that helps with getting around that difficulty of the imagery doesn't display quite as nicely in the review portal as I was like, just because of those inbuilt WebGIS settings that I haven't got access to sort of be able to tweak. I don't have the skills to be able to tweak essentially. So in my opinion, and we'll open this up for a bit of discussion now, I like local relief model, and I'm sure some of you have got that from the way I talk about it and the way that I've forced you all to use it really. I think it is the best for spotting most features. I honestly do believe that it's better than nearly any other method in my experience in this landscape. But it does come with that cost of the lack of landscape context. It does come with that cost of the possibility of false features showing up around the edges of steep things like deep pits or steep elevation changes in the landscape. It also has this difficulty of it's quite difficult to tell relative depth. So we have two different pits. They both might appear as sort of relatively black at the bottom, but one may well be 5 meters deep and one may be only 40 centimeters deep. But because the local trends are such, you get them both coming out at the same color. So the relative depth or height of features doesn't come out very clearly from local relief model. terms of sky view factor, despite everyone recommending it for use, I find it quite uncomfortable to look at for long periods because it's a relatively bright white image. I quite like local relief model being kind of muted grey, quite dark. It doesn't make your eyes uncomfortable. Whereas sky view factor, in the Chilterns at least, where we have lots of uplandy bits, it comes out very, very bright, and I don't like that to look at for long periods of time. And I don't think that or the multi-directional hillshade show subtle features very well. That problem of having to restrict the radius of that sky view factor image to right down to 5 meters to try and show those subtle field banks, which I think are some of the most interesting types of features coming out of our LiDAR data, means that lots of our larger features, such as that pillow mound, such as those big, the big ditch, linear ditch and bank and the wood bank, meant they didn't come out very well at all. We didn't get a good view of them. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in there. I'll let you have your say. Any thoughts then on the 2D approaches, your experience? Let's have just 5 minutes, say, to chat about those. Feel free to jump in. You've got anyone got any views there? No problem if you don't.
Yeah.
It's Susan here. I find it's quite interesting. I've used the Environment Agency ones just because I can change them, and actually the effect of changing parameters is quite startling sometimes, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it certainly is a weakness of the system that we've designed. We don't yet have, I think, the power to, for example, what if we could dynamically change the settings as we're looking at the data? Just imagine being able to sort of have a little slider that tweaks the local relief model radius, for example, so you can just adjust it between, 5 meters up to 20 meters there and then, and getting to see what difference that makes. Sadly, it doesn't exist as far as I know, that kind of ability. I wish it did. It must be doable. I'd certainly have the skills to do it, but someone out there will. And so at some point soon, I would hope we would have that technology, and we could potentially be able to embed, build a similar portal to what we've done for the Chilterns, and embed that kind of tweaking of settings in the portal. Yeah.
I tend to use the LRM mostly, but the hillshade does show up a bit, but the LRM seems to be the one that you use for 70% of the work, and just getting there, is there anything there, and then look at it with hillshade just to see if anything else comes out.
Yeah, what difference it makes. So just to show everyone, so this is the 20 pixel radius sky view factor of our area down here. So let's just get it in the right place. So again, that field system just not coming out clearly at all with this 20 pixel radius. But as I said, the linear ditch and bank comes out nice and clearly, and the wood bank comes out nice and clearly, and you can see that they're different. Our pillow mound is reasonably visible. This feature, reasonably visible, not great. Let's change it to the 10 pixel radius. You can see things sharpen up a bit, so we're seeing more small detail. So the small saw pits and things like that start to appear, and the field system banks have got slightly clearer. And then just turn it on to the 5 pixel radius, so I need to adjust the transparency on that. You can see those field banks have got even clearer, but our bigger features, such as that linear wood bank and linear ditch, have got far less clear. That poor little pillow mound has got really rough around the edges. Our pits have gone white in the middle. So actually, the pits were white in the middle from the start, were they? Oh no, so in the 20 pixel, they were quite dark. So just to show you that difference that it can make. Any other thoughts on 2D approaches before we move on to 3D?
Actually, just a couple of things. I think
you started off this Chilterns, and it was a hill fort project, so we were looking at hill forts. So to a certain extent, it can depend on what you're looking for. And your comment about you're sad that archaeologists are still looking at single hillshades, and then that was when I did my first project. So of course it was single hillshades. We very quickly found out you couldn't see everything, so you had other visualizations to look at. And this is where I talked to you before, Ed, about slope analysis. And not that I'm really hung up about charcoal platforms, but that was the only one that you could see them properly in.
Yeah.
And so if you have the luck to have several visualizations, it did depend what you were looking at. And then the next project I worked on was openness, positive and negative, and I positively hated that one. And had very difficult explaining to people that it wasn't really there, and it was, you know, all these field margins, and I was saying you're looking at even difference in crops, and that was quite a tough one. So I'd say the LRM is a superb compromise, if you like, but just beware what you're looking for, you know, and it can vary.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Vivian. Yeah, really good points, and glad to hear you had the same experience as me with using openness, positive and negative. Yeah, really, really confusing visualizations to look at, not at all intuitive, I think is certainly a big issue, particularly obviously where we've designed this project to be as accessible to as many people as possible. You know, this idea of doing citizen science, if we then throw in a visualization type that is actively confusing, I think that would really have harmed our ability to work the project. Thank you. Right, should we press on and look at some 3D stuff?
Just a comment from me, Ed, and I'd support exactly what both Susan and Vivian have said there, which seems like horses for courses in many respects, and therefore what the approach that you've taken is a sort of pragmatic, what works best for such a huge area, and for making the data available on a common platform. So obviously there's going to be some compromise and all that. One of the things I note from using the RVT tool on the Environment Agency data is that you can combine the different displays. You know, take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of the other. And until you started just playing around with the transparency filter here, it kind of hadn't struck me that, yeah, is that actually doing the same thing? Or is it doing something fundamentally different by taking a little bit of several different visualizations and putting them together?
I believe the RVT tool for combined visualization is doing exactly what I'm doing. I think it is just displaying different layers over the top of each other, but I think it goes beyond just transparency. So I think it has the settings to choose different blend modes. I don't fully understand the sort of the maths behind it, but if any of you have ever used Photoshop, for example, you can use different blend modes, so overlay or brighten and things like that. So where different values intersect, overlay each other, they do different things. So no, the RVT version of combined visualizations is more powerful than just changing transparency. I've not had a particularly detailed play with it yet, because when I did have a go and couldn't get it to work very well. So I do need to return to it and see if there are benefits to be had from it.
And so the other comment I would make there, I think is echoing what you're saying, is you could spend an awful lot of time here trying to tweak parameters, which is fine if you're focused on looking at saw pits, for instance, and what you want is to pick out saw pits, or if you want to pick out linear features for Roman roads, you know, but if you want a sort of whole landscape perspective, then I don't think there's an awful lot to be gained by spending hours and hours and hours kind of tweaking the data. But having said that, though, what I think Susan and I and anybody else that's used the Environmental Agency data and the RVT tool will have found is that playing around just simply with the contrast, just as though it was an image in Photoshop, you know, is actually immensely powerful and quite easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the more configurability that we have, the better. And as I say, that dream then is WebGIS with, you know, almost active sliders allowing the alteration of the data. Sadly, I just don't know enough to be able to try and build something like that. And I don't know whether it will come at some point, but it would be lovely. As you say, to find saw pits of SVF, a sky view factor like image like this is fantastic. So maybe if we were to have, let's have a great big saw pit project, we would reprocess the data to get our very best view of the saw pits. But for a project that is covering 1,400 square kilometers, trying to find all different types of archaeology, we obviously have to sort of cut off the ends, don't we, and go for middle ground that hopefully gives us a decent result over the broadest part of the spectrum of features and landscape types that we possibly can. Thanks, everyone. Right, let's move on to look at some 3D stuff. So, is 3D a solution to some of these problems that we've discovered? Is 3D a good partner technique to use in combination with the elements that we've just discussed? So firstly, just talk about a little bit about methods for 3D visualization. The key thing I think to say is that now desktop GIS is supporting 3D environments. It's been sort of coming and growing for a long time, but where we are now with ArcGIS Pro, for example, from Esri, that now has pretty powerful and ever improving 3-dimensional support, and we'll have a look at that in a second. QGIS, I should have looked this up. I don't actually know where QGIS is with regards to 3-dimensional GIS. I know it certainly is in the pipeline. I don't know whether there's sort of early versions out and available already, or whether it is still a little way off. But it will come. I think that's the important thing to say. So having desktop support for manipulating geospatial data in 3 dimensions is increasing. With that, and with regards to, in particular, looking at and using LiDAR data, bespoke software has been made for manipulating it. And one of the most popular around at the moment, the one that you'll see every Friday on Twitter or every Wednesday, with the hashtags Hillforts Wednesday and hashtag Friday LiDAR, are people using this piece of software called PlanLAF Terrain, which was launched a few years ago now, but it's still being developed, still improving, really coming on leaps and bounds. It's a very, this is always an important consideration. It's a relatively inexpensive piece of software, which makes it very attractive for lots of people to use. And it really is allowing people to use LiDAR data in 3 dimensions relatively easily. It doesn't take a lot of sort of technical skills to pick it up and start to use it, use nice outputs. And it allows you to do lots of the things that you might want 3D LiDAR sort of visualizations for. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then you'll find other people using LiDAR, potentially making an image using 3D GIS or bespoke 3D LiDAR software like PlanLAF Terrain, but then post-processing it or rendering it using broader application 3D software, such as 3D modeling software like DS Max, Maya, Cinema 4D. You might see people making an image using 3D software and then manipulating it in 2D software such as Photoshop or Illustrator. You sometimes come across fantastic little bits of software. There's this one called Aerial OD. I'll show you some images that people have created using that, which just allow you to enhance the image that you're putting out from a 3D space. So some of the advantages of 3D. And I'll say we'll look at some examples in a second. With 3-dimensional manipulation of LiDAR data, you always get good landscape context. And I think in some ways this has got to be the main reason to use 3-dimensional LiDAR sort of visualizations, is to give you a really good idea of what is the broader shape of the landscape, what is the relative location of sites in the landscape, and how do they relate to each other sort of topographically. I think that is the really main reason why, or the main way that 3D visualization of LiDAR data can improve and enhance what we can get from the data. Another really powerful element to 3D approaches is that many now come with this idea of dynamic lighting. So as you move the model around, it will be being lit from different directions, and in doing so, you completely avoid any, or you can certainly minimize issues of using single directional hillshades. In many cases, that dynamic lighting will be in essence replicating a single directional hillshade, but just in a sort of live view that as you rotate the model, obviously you'll be rotating that azimuth and that angle, sun angle, and so you will be hopefully minimizing those issues of a single directional hillshade. So that is another really powerful element to three-dimensional LiDAR. A third element that I think is really neat is that you can obviously layer on other two-dimensional visualization types within your three-dimensional space, over your three-dimensional surface. So you're not only dynamically lighting it, so bringing in that power of a single directional hillshade. Don't get me wrong, as much as there are problems with it, it is still a very powerful approach to trying to spot archaeology. So the dynamic lighting gives you that power, but we can combine it very neatly with our other powerful two-dimensional visualization techniques like local relief model or sky view factor. So that's another really good pro of 3D approaches. I mentioned the difficulty with, for example, local relief model of relative depths or heights of features. With a three-dimensional approach, obviously you can maybe improve on that. And I think something to really emphasize and not overlook is the power of a 3D model or a 3D space, a 3D image for engaging people. A 3D image is I think, far more eye-catching, far more interesting for broad swathes of the population to look at than just a kind of slightly weird, black and white image of LiDAR data. Even if that black and white image is potentially showing you more archaeological information, the 3D space is more fun to play with. I think that just has to be said. Particularly if you're trying to engage younger audiences or audiences who aren't necessarily all that engaged already with archaeology. Manipulating, playing with a 3D space is more fun than just a 2D image. So as I said, desktop GIS is one route into manipulating 3D software, and ArcGIS Pro includes 3D GIS as part of it. So they have these things called scenes, so local scenes and global scenes, which allow you to essentially layer your spatial data, your two-dimensional spatial data, into a 3D environment. Hopefully you're seeing this okay. I apologize if the headaches of internet and Teams mean that you're not getting fantastic resolution on the video feed that you're getting, but hopefully you can see we've got a 3D landscape here, so we can see the hills jumping up out of the landscape, and I have over the top layered our sky view factor image. And so in doing so, have we made our image more powerful? So one thing to say that I hadn't appreciated from our 2D images is just how much higher the landscape is up here than, for example, the sort of nose of land out here. So our more southerly field system is right up on the very top, whereas the sort of more northerly of the two field systems was actually on a relatively sort of lower promontory of land sticking out there. So that's potentially quite interesting. That's something I hadn't picked up at all from even our hillshade image. Worth emphasizing here that the scale factor of the height variation has been emphasized, what's the word? Exaggerated. So I've got a vertical exaggeration of ×2 on the altitude scale factor. So this is another power, I think, of 3D GIS like that, is I can really exaggerate things to a great degree. I've just flicked it back down to 1, and hopefully it's loaded. There we go, it has loaded. You can see it's far less extreme. So this is the real relative height variation, and even so, we can still. Sorry, gone into it. Oh no. We will talk about this in a second. This is a potential con of 3D approaches. We can see that the height variation between those two sort of plateaus is less than we saw it before, but it is still there. So this is 3D data in desktop GIS. Worth noting, I've had problems doing this in that, for example, I'm having to use Esri's inbuilt kind of generic ground surface. Now, I don't actually know what the resolution of their digital terrain model, is for the ground surface that they use as the kind of native inbuilt ground surface. I have tried and failed to get both our LiDAR DTM, our LiDAR-derived DTM, so that 25 centimeter resolution model in here as the ground surface, because just think how brilliant that would be, because then we would have the real life variation in altitude of all of these earthworks. As it is, there isn't actually any three-dimensionality to these earthworks. If I zoom in and try and get a nice sort of side-on image of them, you will see that actually they are flat in our landscape, and because they obviously aren't detected by that Esri digital terrain model. Sadly, I've not managed to get our LiDAR-derived digital terrain model to work. I don't know why, nor have I managed to get the Ordnance Survey 5-meter resolution digital terrain model, which I assume is better than Esri's DTM. I haven't been able to get that to work either. So I don't know why. Maybe it's something I'm doing wrong, or maybe it is that this stuff is just difficult to deal with still. Another thing to point out, as we've seen, this is not very easy to manipulate, is it? A second ago, I got lost underneath the ground surface. It's quite laggy to move around, and this is not just a feature of this being a remote desktop, you know, all the way in China, whereas I'm in Reading. This is just a feature of trying to use 3D data. It is more difficult to manipulate. It's slower to manipulate. It sort of has this lag to it, which is quite frustrating to work with. And the other thing to say is that it results actually also in lower quality to the image that we're looking at. Even though our sky view factor image here is, you know, really high resolution, you know, 25 centimeter resolution image, for some reason, using it in the 3D local scene in ArcGIS, they have reduced the quality of that overlay, presumably as part of speeding up the rendering and loading of the imagery. So we're actually losing information by using it in the 3D environment. Potentially, we're certainly losing quality of the information. You can see how pixelated these trackways are starting to look as I zoom out. So that's another possible downside to the current state of 3D GIS, at least with regards to ArcGIS. PlanLab Terrain, another piece of software I mentioned. So this is a bespoke piece of software for manipulating three-dimensional information and sort of displaying it. So the power of this, as you can see, it's less laggy than ArcGIS is, so I can move around it a bit faster. It's also maintained much better quality of the imagery for some reason. It's obviously just better at dealing with that. Here you can see we've got sky view factor image overlaid on our 3D landscape. Again, the 3D landscape, I think in this case, has got a ×2 exaggeration in altitude variation. I can manipulate that on the fly again. So we can play with things. We can play to some degree with, in this case, our sky view factor. It's not local relief. So, for example, we can up the contrast of it, sort of in a live way, I think. Can you see it changing at all? It is changing, but not very impressively. If we change that scale factor again, maybe we need to reload it. Okay, so it doesn't quite go live, but there you go. We've changed the exaggeration, we've changed the contrast, and you can see we kind of can really make things quite extreme and start to try and pull more features out of here. Just to say a bit about PlanLab Terrain. So the way that this is particularly powerful is that it uses, I think, I could be wrong in this, but I think it uses technology essentially from the computer games industry to take our digital terrain models and take a statistical approach to reducing the file size of them, or sort of the information that they have to display, this idea of mesh decimation, in ways that, in sort of smart ways that reduces the file size considerably more than it reduces the information that you see. So it chooses areas where it thinks we can lose triangles or vertices from our digital terrain model here because they don't really add much to the overall picture, but we'll obviously leave in the vertices where they're important for keeping height data in there. So let's just zoom in on Pulpit Hill Fort. So you can see this is real 3D data. We can actually see, unlike in ArcGIS, we can actually see proper three-dimensionality to those ramparts on Pulpit Hill. So this is a lovely piece of software, really, really powerful, being developed all the time. And it's really popular now on, for example, people on Twitter sharing images from it. It has some really lovely tools for allowing you to kind of create displays. So you can choose a point around which to rotate, or you can create a kind of fly through of the landscape, zooming in on different features of interest that you can then export as a video or as a model that you can stick up on Twitter, for example. So really fantastic for communicating archaeology and communicating sort of digital terrain archaeology, LiDAR archaeology. So that's a rather lovely piece of software that's great fun to use, very powerful, and developing all the time. So it's fantastic to see new features coming out of it. Just finally, to finish, that one I mentioned called Aerial OD is a really interesting piece of software. It's I've got to remember what it does. It essentially is a piece of rendering software. So it takes kind of approaches from, again, the computer games industry and photography, this idea of sort of tilt shift, almost blurring the background and putting a sharp focal point in the image. Gives you lots of tools for manipulating this data set to create really, I think, engaging images. So I've not made any, I'm no good with it. I haven't made anything good with it, but lots of people on Twitter making really beautiful things. So this is obviously using a DSM, a digital surface model, so it's still got some trees in there. This is a Roman fort over in Wales. You can see the lovely earthworks of the hill fort there. And I think this kind of thing is really engaging. People love looking at this kind of image for some reason. Tilt shift is really popular. It just gives a lovely sense of the depth of the landscape. Here's another one from a chap called Phil Barrett on Twitter. Salisbury Hill, so this is just around the edge of Bath. So Salisbury Hill, hill fort there in the middle. This is Environment Agency DSM data. And just, really engaging, attractive image that just that makes me want to learn more about this landscape. It makes me want to explore this landscape. So that's this piece of software called Aerial OD. Very funny little bit of really simple software, but just creates these beautiful, engaging images. So some of the sort of positives of, well, let's talk about positives and negatives of 3D approaches. Number one there, 3D models can be large and cumbersome to use, even with a high performance computer. So that desktop that I was showing you, the ArcGIS Pro version on, that's got 32 gigabytes of RAM, a really powerful graphics card, a really powerful CPU. It shouldn't struggle with many tasks, but it obviously struggles with working with that. I think that's probably largely a software issue rather than a hardware issue. But as a general rule, 3D datasets do require more powerful computing to manipulate. And as I said there, I can't get ArcGIS to load either our 25 centimeter LiDAR-derived DTM or the OS 5 meter resolution DTM. So I don't quite know why that is, but it's obviously a problem. Another issue here might be when it comes to sharing data. If the data sets are large, they become harder to send to someone. And if we're needing a powerful computer to visualize them, then that immediately starts to narrow down the number of people who are able to work with the data. All users will need a powerful graphics card, for example, in order to look at this stuff potentially. I think it's worth caveating that slightly in that I was actually looking at the file sizes of the different data sets. So, oops, missed. The digital terrain model of this pulpit kind of case study area that I created, that is 170 megabytes in size, the digital terrain model. The visualizations that I then created from that, so for example, let's look at that sky view factor image. You can see that that 5 pixel radius sky view factor image, that's 250 megabytes in size, so much larger than the DTM. That's for the 16-bit version of the image. The 8-bit version is smaller, so it's only 65 megabytes, but obviously has less detail in it. It can be opened by more programs on, you can use it essentially like a JPEG almost. It can be opened in just image viewing software on most computers, but it will have far less sort of information in that image. But compare that actually to PlanLaf Terrain's tile file for our 3D model that you can see in the background here. That's only 120 megabytes. So actually that's smaller than our simple 2D sky view factor image. So that I thought was quite interesting. So whilst we might assume that they're going to be bigger, Plan Life Terrain's got this very clever mesh decimation approach to dealing with digital terrain model, and it has managed to you know, really compress the file size there. So that's very handy. Yeah, so with good compressional storage systems, we can deal with 3D data in efficient ways still. I mean, 120 megabyte, 150 megabyte file is still quite hard to send to someone. You're going to have to upload it online for someone to download. You can't email it. But that's true of all of our LiDAR data, really. You can obviously upload things to online services like Sketchfab. So just to show you an example of a 3D model that's been exported into Sketchfab. So this is viewed in a browser now. So this is quite powerful. We'll see this in a second. You know, being able to, anyone can load this if they've got Chrome or Safari or a modern browser on their computer. They will almost certainly be able to view this, and you can see how responsive this model is. You know, there's no lag at all in moving this around and zooming in, which is good. I'm sure you can all see the downside though. I cannot see very much in the way of detail in here. So the saw pits, you can just about make them out, but you know, it's a bit of an ugly model, isn't it, compared to the full beauty of our lovely high resolution LiDAR dataset. It doesn't look all that great. So, you know, it is one way of sharing 3D data so that anyone can use it, which is obviously a good thing, but at the end of the day, not a very nice image to look at. More downsides, something that we noticed when I was doing the demonstration in ArcGIS, navigating around a three-dimensional space using a computer mouse is quite difficult. You know, in Plan Life Terrain, he's got this whole little array of tools at the top here. So currently I've got pan selected. So if I click and drag with my left mouse button, we move sideways. But if I want to rotate, I know to select a different tool and then we can rotate. If I want to zoom in and out, then I have then select a different tool, and oh no, it wasn't that one, and then I can zoom in and out. So that's quite a sort of fiddly thing to do. With a mouse with 3 buttons, so left click, right click, and a middle click, you can sort of combine these. So now left click is move around, middle click is to rotate, and actually right click doesn't do anything. So yeah, I can use middle click as a quick version, quick way of rotating. You could use keyboard shortcuts, for example, to do the same thing. ArcGIS does that. But even so, it's quite fiddly, and particularly when you've got a sort of laggy view, you can quite easily end up, you know, jumping underneath the landscape, or you know, if your mouse runs over a hair on your mouse mat, it jumps all over the place, and suddenly you get quite lost. So I do think there's a real problem there, that 3D space is difficult to navigate using computer mouse. I wonder, I've not experienced this, but I wonder whether, you know, VR headsets and controllers, those little funny trigger controllers that come with things like the Oculus Rift or Vive, could they be a solution? I've not experienced using them. I've not tested out how well that works, but I wonder whether that might be an approach that could be of use. And now here's, I think, a really important issue, which is the question of, does the extra stimulation of having a 3D environment, does it really help you spot archaeology, or does it in fact draw your attention away from subtle archaeological features? I think that's something that would only come, you know, you only learn that with use. But I certainly find, if I'm wandering around in this environment, I find it quite difficult to focus in on trying to spot a particular archaeological feature. So let's have a look and see if we can spot our awkward little wiggly downhill linear feature. I mean, it is there, we can see it. Would I have noticed it in this otherwise quite busy and, you know, stimulating image showing lots of other things? We've obviously got our field systems across the top here. They are visible. Our sky view factor image is bringing them out, but you know, how easily would I have spotted them compared to just looking at a 2-dimensional image and being able to quite easily and systematically go through it? I think this is another issue here. Feature recording in a 3D environment, I think, is going to be very challenging. We can obviously try and make it as the best we can. So when you have a tool for drawing a polygon like we do in the LiDAR portal today, and of course you can just make it so it snaps immediately to the ground surface. So it draws our feature on the ground, fine, that's good stuff. But I think we probably still need to have a vertical view of that feature as you're digitizing it, in order to ensure that it's in the correct place on the map. And after all, I think having something in the correct place on the 2D map is more important than you know, bringing in a third dimension to that information. When it comes to all of the way that we use the archaeological data that we're creating by looking at LiDAR images, we use it on 2D maps. We use it based on the OS map. We use it for planning purposes. We use it for planning an archaeological survey. We're not going to be doing that using 3D environments. We're going to be doing that using a 2-dimensional ordnance survey map in many cases, or an aerial photo. So I think feature recording is another issue with the 3D environment. Does it help us with feature recording? I think that's a tricky question. Let's finish on some positives of 3-dimensional data. Computers themselves and software technology is advancing really rapidly. So I think that 3-dimensional GIS will rapidly get more and get better and better, essentially. Things will become cheaper. And so these 3-dimensional views of LiDAR will become more accessible. And some of the problems we've discussed today, like the lagginess or things not quite working or needing to buy bespoke software, that will go away. QGIS will get free, capability to deal with 3-dimensional GIS soon. I'm pretty sure, if it doesn't. Traditionally, it's been sort of gaming and entertainment industry technologies that are facilitating our ability to deal with 3D environments for doing this kind of study. But as more and more different sectors of the economy invest in 3-dimensional technologies, that will only help archaeology. We never have the money to drive these things ourselves, of course. We're sort of reliant on holding on to the coattails of other wealthier parts of the economy. But as more and more technologies developed by different industries, archaeology will inevitably kind of find the ones that we can come in and act like a magpie and just steal the shiny bits for our own use. So as I say, 3D GIS, it still needs some work, but it's happening. There is demand. The work will come. I mentioned that being able to do Sketchfab, just inbuilt native, so it's called WebGL functionality, means that people can look at 3D in their browsers online. WebGIS is becoming by far and away a real focus for how things work. Our LiDAR portal, it's WebGIS essentially, and we've already got native 3D functionality, JavaScript functionality built into Chrome and Safari and the major browsers. So that's really exciting. It means that not much more is needed in order to really start to make the most of that technology. And ever improving sort of compression and things like this mesh decimation, using pyramid approaches to visualization production means that file sizes will be made smaller, which means that transfer becomes easier. And I think it's worth mentioning mobile platforms as well. People are now getting out and using 2-dimensional LiDAR data on mobile platforms quite regularly. We vaguely trialed it at some of our ground truthing back in February with a little app I made in ArcGIS Online. So loading the LiDAR images onto your phone, onto your tablet. PlanNav Terrain, that 3D software, that has an app which allows you to take a 2D view of your 3D models and take that out into the landscape with GPS and markers and things like that. Surely 3D won't be far behind as processors get ever smaller and ever more powerful with 3D technology. So I think the future is very bright. Whether 3-dimensional approaches will ever replace a 2D top-down 2D visualization approach to scanning LiDAR data for archaeology, I'm not sure it will necessarily replace it, but it may well be in use alongside it. Could you imagine our LiDAR portal as it is, but with a little slider that allows you to in live time adjust the parameters of the local relief model or the skyview factor? And if you needed to just get a quick landscape view of quite where we are in the topography, you could just slant down very quickly to a 3D view to see, oh, that bit's higher than that bit, or that bit's deeper than that bit, and then just click a button and go back to your 2-dimensional top-down view to continue recording. I think that is not too far away as being something that can be done on anyone's computer through a website soon, I hope, and I think it will be certainly an improvement on the situation that we currently have. I think that's all I wanted to say, so I will stop there. Thanks very much for listening. I hope it was interesting, and yeah, do let me know if you've got any questions. Thanks, everyone. Oop.